when we talk about, alors effectivement, lorsqu'on parle.
So indeed, when it comes to weather forecasting, technology really dictates the fact that it's a top-down process. Weather forecasting is carried out by the Meteorologic Service of Canada in Canada, and the Canadian Meteorological Centre, its main facility, is housed in an unassuming building bristling with satellite dishes on Highway 40 in Dorval. Real bouquet of satellite dishes. If you ever drive by there, you'll surely see them all yourselves on the roof. One could easily assume that it's a sports bar with all those antennas picking up the many signals of the variety of sports matches. The horizontal axis, the y-axis, represents the collaborative process involving the provinces and the territories. In order to forecast floods, you have to do more than forecast the weather. You also need a lot of information about the water levels, the speed of movement of waters in our lakes and rivers and so on. And this involves the participation of those who are on the ground, able to see what's actually going on in the provinces and territories.
Data is collected by water gauges and stations located in water bodies across the country, water bodies that are in provincial and territorial jurisdiction, as we know that the water resources belong to the provinces and territories. And this is done under a collaborative and a jointly financed federal-provincial program called the National Hydrological Survey. Now, climate change, we all know, means more frequent and intense flooding and drought events. We therefore need a more accurate flood forecasting system with greater lead times to allow communities to better prepare for floods and to better buttress against them. Fortunately, flood forecasting methods and technologies are rapidly evolving. Technology now allows us to build more sophisticated flood forecasting models that cover larger geographic areas and to which we can attract probabilities of flood risk. Because these models cover larger areas, greater cooperation is required among the jurisdictions, among the provinces, and also among the provinces and the federal government. Because, as I said at the very start, the federal government is responsible for weather forecasting and has some in-house capabilities that are important to flood forecasting, namely in terms of gauging water flows and water levels, et cetera. So it's a collaborative process involving the provinces and the territories and the federal government. Because these models cover larger areas, greater computing power is required to run complex dynamic models. And we're talking here about supercomputers. So supercomputers are required for this kind of large-scale, complicated, complex, probabilistic forecasting. Now, there are many benefits to this cooperation that is in fact a reality already. There are many benefits when flood forecasters work together. As Dr. Pomeroy has pointed out, while some modelers in Canada may predict major floods every year, others may not be called on to predict even one flood in their entire career. So a national collaborative approach would create opportunities for shared experiences and professional development among flood forecasters in different provinces. There's already a community of forecasters who meet to discuss best practices, but we need a more formal, permanent structure to harness flood forecasting knowledge from jurisdictions across Canada and better move forward together. Some will say that this structure already exists within ECCC, within Environment and Climate Change Canada, and that the department is already involved in flood forecasting. But to quote Dr. Pomeroy, ECCC has not established a national hydrological forecasting service. They have established a federal river and flow forecasting system over part of the country that is exploratory and top-down, but it does not have the participation of the provinces and territories. Nowhere in the Canadian Meteorological Service's published core mandate does one find a requirement to engage with provinces and territories on flood and drought forecasting. What is being developed currently is a federal system of stream flow prediction, not a cooperative national in scope flood forecasting system, and there's a difference. At the moment, the Canadian Meteorological Service stream flow models help predict the volume of water passing through an area under different weather scenarios. This information is useful in decisions about irrigation and hydroelectricity generation. Stream flow models are also being used to improve weather forecasts. For example, if the Canadian Meteorological Centre predicts stream flow will be high because soil moisture in a basin is high, resulting in greater runoff because the land is not absorbing rain, this will be an indicator of greater expected evaporation from the soil. Evaporation in turn influences atmospheric dynamics. With high levels of soil moisture and evaporation, the energy and water in the atmosphere is greater. This in turn influences the weather and the weather forecast. Mais pour prévoir les inondations avec encore plus de précision.
But to predict floods with even greater accuracy, we do need a more nuanced approach, drawing on local data.
Forecasting involves the added complexity of factoring in soil moisture, groundwater saturation, the state of glaciers and snowpack, the topology of the river network, river pinch points, and the state of riverbank erosion. Human decisions pertaining to the regulation of dams and reservoirs must also be factored in. In Canada, flood forecasting is further complicated by the fact that we are a northern country with mountainous regions and lots of ice. River ice jams can raise water levels many meters above the norm, and these don't occur only during spring ice cover breakup. They can happen in the fall freeze-up and midwinter breakup periods as well. Another factor impacting flood risk that has been recently highlighted by Dr. Pomeroy is wildfires, which of course we've seen a lot of in the last couple of years. Wildfires destroy tree canopy, leading to much denser snowpack as more snow accumulates on the ground. Loss of canopy also translates into less shade and more direct sunlight hitting snow, causing it to melt faster. The result is earlier and stronger spring runoff and a greater risk of downstream flooding. Le but de ce projet de loi n'est pas de réinventer.
This bill is not intended to reinvent the wheel. Rather, it encourages the Government of Canada to adapt and to make better use of the latest developments in flood and drought forecasting, both the science and the methods, now that these disasters are more frequent and more intense given climate change.
To Europe, we see that even independent states can achieve the unity of purpose required for accurate flood forecasting on a continental scale. According to Dr. Pomeroy, and I'm sure you'll speak more about this, the prototype European flood forecasting
Monsieur
system.
Scarpaleggia.
No.
Mr. Scarpaleggia? Oh, my. Oh, very well. He'll pick up on all this later. Dr. Pomeroy will pick up on this, about what's been happening in Europe and how relevant that model is for Canada. Thank you very much, Mr. Scarpaleggia. Mr. Pomeroy, welcome to our committee meeting. I think this is the second time we've had you with us. I remind you that Mr. Pomeroy is the Canada Research Chair, Water Resources and Climate Change at the University of Saskatchewan. You have the floor, sir, for 5 minutes.
Very much. Thank you very much. 11 years ago, my ideas around what became this bill began to gel as it rained for 3.5 days over the mountains west of Calgary, Alberta, in late June of 2013, 250 millimeters on a late-line snowpack. The flood started. We had 15 people in the field from the University of Saskatchewan, including several professors or colleagues. And what we found was absolutely incredible, the generation of these floods in the mountains, rushing down towards Canmore, towards High River, and eventually towards Calgary. What we did not see in time, even after the evacuations were starting in Canmore, was the flood warning from the province of Alberta that a massive flood was on the way. 4 people died in that flood. Over $5 billion of damages occurred in the region. It was the most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history at that time. Almost a year later, a year and a month later, in Saskatchewan, which only has had snowmelt flooding since it incorporated as a province in 1905. The rain started in eastern Saskatchewan, over 200 millimeters of rain, causing rainfall-based flooding over eastern Saskatchewan in basins that had only had snowmelt flooding at a time of year when the creeks are normally dry and farmers are looking after their growing crops and all of that. Again, this overwhelmed the provincial capability, which was designed for snowmelt flooding, which you can plan for by watching the snowpack accumulate. So, these were incredible lessons that we had to better understand flood forecasting in Canada. The other lesson is as Mrs. Scarpelaccia mentioned, the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting was running an experimental product in 2013, which gave a reasonable estimate of the magnitude of the Calgary floods 10 days before it happened. They didn't communicate it to Canadians. It was just a test product, but it showed what was possible, and it gave us an aspiration to what Canadians could do if we brought our technologies together and worked together as a country on this exceedingly difficult problem. Flood and drought damages have risen dramatically in Canada since then and are expected to rise further due to extreme weather and water events, due to climate change, coupled with our growing communities and our increasing agriculture and industrial production. Floodplains are growing, droughts are intensifying, and many community farms and industries are impacted by this. In 2022, the Aquanomics report estimated that to 2050, GDP loss in Canada due to droughts, floods, and storms will total $174 billion. In the Global Water Futures Program, which I direct, we estimate that Canadian damages have exceeded $40 billion only up to last year from the year 2000 from these events. So things are getting worse. How do we deal with it in Canada? We have the prediction in Canada follows a piecemeal governance approach. We have provincial and territorial systems developed bottom-up, which work to meet local needs, and a federal system developed top-down from the weather forecast system, as mentioned. Neither are interoperable, and neither meet the full suite of current needs we have in the country. The fragmented approach has led to slow adoption of new technology and methods by the provinces and limited uptake of the more sophisticated federal system. There is a desire and need for common modeling frameworks, common approaches, and coordinated forecast systems. And this is what countries like the United States do. This is what Europe does. This is what other major countries do. In Global Water Futures, we established, with the help of Environment Canada, a pilot forecast demonstration project for the Yukon Territory. We developed a state-of-the-art prediction system for the Yukon River Basin, and we transferred this to the Yukon government for its operational forecasts. Technical challenges in running such a complex hydrological computer system meant that we've been running the system for the Yukon government since 2018. Remember, the Yukon Territory is 40,000 people. It doesn't have the technical expertise so far to run a system like this without assistance. A federal, provincial, territorial cooperative system could far better ensure that resources and technologies are available to support operational forecasting and prediction from these co-developed systems. A few recommendations for how we might have a more coherent flood and drought forecasting and prediction framework in Canada are, one, the framework should be developed to coordinate local, regional, federal, and international efforts. Remember, we have shared river basins with the United States, and to enable the authorization of state-of-the-art science and technological advances in forecasting and prediction. The national framework should be co-developed with a top-down and bottom-up approach to be mindful of local realities and build credibility and trust between academics, users, government, policy, and practice.
Monsieur Pomeroy, je dois malheureusement vous
Unfortunately, Mr. Pomeroy, I must interrupt you.
avoir l'occasion.
I think you'll have a chance to elaborate on your recommendations as you respond to questions put by members of the committee. Let me check something with Mr. Mazzi.
2 petites secondes, tout le monde.
In just a moment, everyone, we will just turn the chair over to our chair, Mr. Mazzi.
put that on. Okay, I guess we start off with questioning, and Mr. Leslie, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for bringing this bill forward. Obviously, as a representative of Manitoba, we have been prone to floods for centuries, but getting worse of late thanks to some of our neighbors and some land use changes in particular. And I recently had the chance to speak with Manitoba's Hydrological Forecast Center to get a bit of a better understanding of how we could benefit from a national forecasting service, because obviously we have a desire to control our water flows and mitigate, to retain water and mitigate floods. Not to say there's any concerns from that conversation, but I'm hoping for some points of clarity. I'll start with the sponsor, but perhaps Mr. Pomeroy, you can aid in some of the responses. One of the concerns, or one of my concerns, was if we have a federal service, there may be confusion from what comes out of the province. Obviously, we rely on, particularly Manitoba, as a leader in this space on those flood forecasts. Would there be two streams of information, or would it be the federal national organization sharing with the province for them to distribute the flood forecasting? Because the concern would be if you have two sets of different forecast information, it might not align and might lead to some of the challenges that you've alluded to already.
Is that to me? Yeah.
Whoever's best placed.
Well, I will pass it to Dr. Pomeroy, but I would expect that there would be the coordination would prevent those kinds of overlapping situations from occurring. I think that's part of the objective here, is to rationalize the system and enhance and to improve the system of flood forecasting and drought forecasting. So my understanding is this system would, this new structure would actually prevent that from happening. Is that correct?
Yes, what I've proposed, and in discussions with the provincial forecasters and federal government, what we think is the best pose is that the high-end, exceedingly complex computer models are run federally and tied into the weather forecast, and then but then tailored to the needs of the provinces so that they can issue the forecast as the one authoritative source in there. Okay. And also taking into account multiple model outputs. Remember, there's nothing preventing Google from doing this as well, and then or others, so we can get lots of different forecasts, and that adds to confusion. So the idea is to coordinate, so it's something authoritative, and that this is what we go with.
Okay. So right now, as it stands, are the provinces and territories harmonized in their statistical techniques that they use for the hydrological concepts? Like, are we currently aligned, or would there be necessity through this body to have the provinces work with the same processes from a statistical standpoint?
Go ahead, please.
In 2019, with the help of Environment Canada, we convened a meeting of the 13 territorial and provincial forecasting groups. They had never met before. So we started an informal community of practice to share things, but they were all building the wheel separately by themselves, and everyone said, oh, we don't have enough resources to do this. So there's a lot to be gained by working together, and that's where perhaps a federal initiative can help grease those wheels to help it happen. I think a lot of the activity is going to be provincial, but it varies tremendously depending on jurisdiction. We have big, rich provinces which have fairly sophisticated systems, and we have smaller provinces and territories which are using Excel spreadsheets. So it's pretty different, that capability right now.
So one of the things I learned in talking with our provinces forecasters is they're pretty sophisticated, but in the areas of population. So northern and more remote locations don't have that same sort of technology. Would this be a way that we could have those gaps kind of filled so that more northern, remote, Indigenous communities might have access to the same level of forecasting information?
Yes, I think the objective will be continental scale forecasting and prediction, and so that even the really remote parts of the north would have this. The other thing I say is that the system can predict many things, including soil moisture, including forest fire likelihood due to duff layer moisture, and aspects of drought. And so a single system can have multiple purposes, including drought and a wildfire risk, which could be really beneficial.
How would that information be shared? Because I think that's a good point. If we could actually better understand and mitigate wildfires, how would that information be shared through this National Forecasting Service to the Canadian Forest Service or whatever appropriate body that would be?
Right now, the federal system is shared just with a few select users. It's not a public system. Through there, a cooperative system could with the imprint of the provinces and okay of the provinces be shared more widely in that sense. Again, the crucial thing is to avoid confusion over what the risks are, and but to maximize the outflow of that information and the information sharing.
Would we anticipate that the National Forecasting Centre would be using LiDAR flood mapping for the high-risk areas, or would that be outside of the scope, would you predict?
The hydraulic routing that is usually done using LiDAR flood mapping has been proven to be best done locally. And that's in particular where the communities and the provincial governments have tremendous expertise, and that's where their roles, as one example, would come in very strongly into this.
So one of the challenges, obviously, with predicting climate change and the impacts of, I think, is aided but perhaps more easily accessible was the land use changes that have happened over a number of years. But I think that's also something that is information that's held and known more locally. How would you see the provinces and municipalities working with the National Centre to try to share some of that information so you have the best assumptions in your modeling?
With a good community of practice and shared system that's truly federal provincial, then you have that information going up into the national model. For instance, we've been working on wetland drainage impacts on changing hydrology in the prairies, and we've developed algorithms that are now into the federal model called MESH, which can look at that and over time say, well, as these wetlands are drained, there'll be this change in flood likelihood over time.
Okay, sorry, but was there anything, did you need anything tabled there or anything, Brendan? You're good? Okay. Another 6 minutes, Mr. Van Couverton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Pomeroy and MP Scarpelagia, Mr. Chair, today. Thank you for bringing this very important bill forward. To you, Dr. Pomeroy, it sure seems to me like floods and droughts and things of the sort related to extreme weather events happen more frequently these days. It seems as though a lot of that impression might be driven by a 24-hour news cycle and a heightened awareness and attention on those matters. But is it accurate to suggest that property damage and natural disasters on that scale with respect to floods and droughts and extreme weather on the coast are happening more and more frequently?
Certainly the payouts for these disasters have increased dramatically. There was roughly $1 billion of damages from these events from Confederation up to the year 2000. We're estimating it's about $40 billion since the year 2000. So that's gone up quite a bit. In some basins, flood frequency and magnitude has increased. In others, it's changed in timing. But there is global evidence now that drought frequency and occurrence is increasing. Also, there's direct scaling of rainfall intensity with air temperatures. As air temperatures go up, storms become more intense. It comes out of the calculations and it comes out of the observations as well that we see around the world. So we're seeing this, and we're seeing these shifts. I mean, areas that used to get their floods from snowmelt are now getting it from rainfall or rain on snow events. And so that's really problematic for Canadians because we're getting floods that we're not familiar with occurring. And all of our engineering designs go back over a century from the 20th century's climate, and now we're facing the need for designs that are based on what is still to come.
Yeah, thank you. We're experiencing some pretty wacky watershed events in Halton region right now because we don't have a snow melt. There's been a considerable amount of rain recently, but it's just a very, very different situation in our creeks and rivers. But I'm very concerned about the impact that will have on our flood mapping because I don't think that our flood mapping will necessarily change as a result of changing weather patterns. Is it important for conservation authorities in Ontario to go back to the drawing books a little bit and look at some of those flood mapping, or is it strictly still about the elevation of various places and their proximity to streams, creeks, and rivers?
The ability to calculate future floodplains has been developed. Colleagues and I from Global Water Futures have a paper in review describing the technique, which we applied it to the Bow River above Calgary in response to those events to look at how those flood frequencies will change by the end of the century. And so it's possible to do this for all of Canada now. We simply need to sit down and do it.
Okay. And if we are seeing these flood frequencies increase, certainly the magnitude of the destruction is going up because of what we've built along those areas. Perhaps that's a warning for the future to cut it out. Otherwise, we're going to experience more and more destruction from those. But what's the cause? What could be attributed as a cause for the increase in frequency for these flooding events?
The change in frequency of the flooding, occurrence of flooding, sometimes is due to development. Our communities really like to develop floodplains because that's the most desirable property, and people want lakefronts or riverfronts for their homes. But it's also the change in the nature of storms. So storms cluster much more now than they used to. We get more multiple day storms and greater storm intensities, greater rainfall intensities, and now in some cases more rain on snow, depending on the elevation. So all these are working together to make those changes to our flood regimes in Canada. We now even have glacier melt caused floods. The peak flood in Whitehorse, Yukon occurred in 2021, started by that heat dome that occurred that year, and it was the Llewellyn Glacier and other snowpacks in the mountains above Whitehorse melting away at rapid pace. They'd never seen this before. So this is what we've got now.
Okay. So in what ways, with respect to all of these realities of the current the current situation and what we can do to mitigate some of these destructive events, or at least mitigate the impact that they have, in what ways will a national strategy aid in the delivery of more timely and reliable forecasting and information?
The number of things. One is with an adequate prior forecast, people can take personal action. You can get things out of your basement, you can evacuate the area, you can secure your businesses, you can protect your farms. Lots you can do. Lots of sandbagging can be done with a few days' notice. You can reduce, provincial agencies can reduce the water storage in reservoirs to provide capacity for water to fill in. Furthermore, the better predictions can allow for better floodplain mapping, help the insurance industry come up with reliable and suitable costs for flood insurance across the country that are based on the best science, and also allow for communities and provinces and territories to plan for future development to avoid excess costs in the future. These things can be used for water supply forecasting. It can help us look at irrigation expansion. It can help us restore natural functions to rivers and wetlands, deltas, on and on. It's many, many things. And hydroelectricity, which is a massive one.
Thanks, Dr. Pomeroy.
Van Courden, Monique. Ms. Posé, 6 minutes.
Merci. Alors,
Very well. My question then is it's somewhat in line with what's been asked so far. We know that there are 4 departments involved, though, to touch on that. I think this is part of the bill. There's the Minister of the Environment, Minister of Agriculture and Agro-Food, Public Safety as well. Basically, there are 4 in all. In the strategy, which is laid out in Section 3, where we cover new investments with an overview of infrastructures and a national structure, we see a National Hydrological Forecasting Service to be created. So that's what I'm focusing on. Why not first really rework Canada's meteorological services as they exist? Why create a different structure? Is that advantageous? Why not simply gather people together and review how CMS works? As we said at the outset, both of us, I believe, the Canadian Meteorological Services of Canada really works on a top-down model. It's not a collaborative model. We feel that the new system should include much more cooperation, be well-structured, though. So this bill aims to structure that sort of interaction. But to cooperate, we need to obviously lean on the Canadian Meteorological Services, which are up and running. This is a program that allows provinces and the federal government to work together to share costs. The aim is really to evolve the thinking around the management of flood forecasting to get the best of both worlds, as I was explaining, vertical and horizontal. Obviously the weather forecasting comes down to us from satellites, really. Like it or not, it's a top-down model. That said, we do need more horizontal cooperation across the local governments and territories and so on. It's really to ensure that everyone is working together and working with all the pieces of the puzzle. And many of those pieces are already on the board, but at present, the approach is somewhat informal, so we're simply asking for this informal approach, which is heading in the right direction, to be structured and recognized with a proposal, which, of course, could evolve, but to begin with would include what I've mentioned so that we can move forward together. We do know that the departments and so on tend to work independently. They don't always cooperate. This is the new style, which is, of course, being used more and more. It seems to me that part of the work laid out in the bill is already being carried out, though. So will the bill really improve matters? Will a national strategy, and we know that national strategies are things that Liberals tend to prefer. But anyway, would a national strategy in this matter, in flood and drought forecasting, really be an improvement on current approaches? Let's look at Quebec. Quebec has its own territorial protection program and plans for its own territory and flooding of it. So how will a national Canadian plan really improve the situation when it has already been taken over by the governments of the provinces or the territories, such as in Quebec? The provinces are moving forward on these matters, of course. The aim of cooperation would be to allow for sharing of information. As Dr. Pomeroy has pointed out, there are some provinces that are working well, have very good resources, have good capacity in this area, a good deal of expertise. However, other provinces aren't really up to scratch. That's the idea. That's the federal model, isn't it? Some provinces need a little more help, can benefit from interacting with others. The system allows us all to work together. Even provinces, though, that are well-resourced in this area are seeing knowledge move forward so quickly that they, too, could benefit from sharing knowledge and sharing more recent practices. The area, then, is very dynamic, you see. I think that everyone could benefit from working more closely together. Could you assure us that this bill is really meeting a real need and is not just, proposing a different way of making sure the federal government does what other governments are already doing? No, as I was explaining, at least 4 departments are involved, and they tend to work independently at the federal level. And this strategy will encourage them to work together, hopefully to work better together, and to come up with a more united service.
Ms. Collins for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the member for putting forward this important bill. Thank Mr. Pomeroy for being here as a witness today, and for all your work. We know that the just unprecedented weather events that have impacted Canadians. It used to be that we were talking about a scary future, but now we're talking about the scary present that we are living through. In British Columbia, we're experiencing multi-year droughts at the same time as extreme flooding and evacuations. And so I noticed the preamble of this talks a bit about how there are communities and industries, notably the farming industry, that are inordinately impacted by floods and droughts, and that's so true. We also know that many Indigenous communities face far greater risk of weather-related emergencies. How do you see governments working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and nations to implement these kind of policies and really making sure that they are leading some of this work?
Well, I'll pass it on to Dr. Pomeroy after my initial comments, but my understanding is that the strategy would bring everyone to the table. So it would receive input, it would benefit from input from all stakeholders, provinces, territories, industry, First Nations, Métis, and then the idea is to see how best to translate the predictive knowledge to how communities on the ground are buttressing themselves against these natural disasters. Is that a correct way of seeing it, or I'm sure you can add more nuance, Dr. Pomeroy?
It's a start. One thing we found in the Global Water Futures program is that there was almost nowhere in Canada where there was a flood prediction point on First Nations territory, on Indigenous territory. We put them in the big cities, and that's where the gauges went, and that's where the prediction points went. So it is an easy win there, is to start making sure that we're actually predicting flooding directly on reserves. The second is to bring in Indigenous knowledge into this, and it's something we did with co-led projects, because there may not be gauges there for a long time, but there are long memories of when floods have occurred, how they occurred, when they occurred, things like that. And you bring that in to do a kind of a test of our predictions to make sure that they have some reality to them. And the other is that we tend to focus on, for floods, we focus on economic damages. So we talk about $6 billion in Calgary. We don't talk about human suffering so much. And the suffering is often much more profound in the more vulnerable and poorer communities. And there are some in Manitoba and elsewhere in the country that have had long-term evacuations due to flooding, and they're not getting back to their communities. And this is destructive in such a fundamental way to the whole society so we need to better account for those problems.
Thanks so much. The impact on farmers is profound when it comes to drought and flooding, and the economic costs, the human costs. I'm curious if you can speak more broadly to our food system and the impacts that the flooding and drought have on our food systems here in Canada.
Well, the recent drought has had an incredible impact on our agriculture. So many ranchers in the southwestern prairies have been reducing their herds, also in BC and elsewhere. In the Palliser Triangle area of southwestern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, the dryland farmers have had disastrous years for multiple years now. And the irrigators, that's why irrigation was introduced to this area. In the part of that one of the irrigation districts just had the announcement that they'll be getting half of their normal allocation of water because of a shortage of runoff from the Rockies anticipated this year. So it is affecting food in many ways. Manitoba has experienced many years with flooding where it was impossible to get crops going, and some provinces have sometimes had flooding and drought in the same years, depending where you were, which farms were affected. So crop insurance carries this, but crop insurance is based on averages, and so long-term droughts, long-term flooding starts to decrease the benefit there, and it tends to be heavily subsidized by the rest of society. So the whole thing becomes eventually untenable if we don't take some action. But by prediction, if a farmer knew reliably in January what the drought situation would be, and they could plan their seeding, plan what they're going to do with their fields, the irrigation district could better manage what they're doing, that we could reap a tremendous economic benefit and a food security benefit from this as well. That's what I'd like to see in the future.
Thank you so much. Mr. Scarpaleggia, as a member of the government, I'm sure you've had conversations with the Minister of Environment about the importance of freshwater security, flooding, droughts. Why do you think that the minister hasn't implemented this flood and drought strategy before, 8 years in?
Well, I know that he's very supportive of this bill. I've spoken to him about it. As I was saying at the beginning, ECCC is working on elements of this system that we're trying to create, and I think that the government should be working faster and more broadly with the provinces and territories and First Nations and industry and so on. I just, I think it should be a priority, and that's what the bill is signaling, that we need to move a bit faster. But some work has been done. There's work happening within the federal bureaucracy. It may be disjointed, but it's happening. And as Dr. Pomeroy said, there have been meetings, but they're not terribly formalized, and they're more ad hoc. So,
Whoa. I'm sorry I had to interrupt you. I was enamored when you were talking about agriculture. So
okay. So I didn't
we're going to go
over.
on to our second round, and we'll start with Mr. Cram for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair or Acting Chair, I could say, and Mr. Chair, good to see you in the witness location today, and Dr. Pomeroy, thank you for joining us as well. I think everyone can recognize the value of improved drought forecasting and improved flood forecasting. I think we also have to recognize the value of being good stewards of the public purse. So I wonder if you can give us an idea of how much this entire system and program will cost in terms of upfront costs as well as the annual operations.
I don't know. And I don't know because I'm not in government, and I don't have access to the information that government would have around this kind of issue. If it has this information, the whole point of the bill is to not pressure, but to incite government to collect that information, to estimate what such a system would look like and how much it would cost. And then the government can decide whether it feels it's worth the cost or not. But my role is really to try and accelerate things a little bit. But I don't know. I don't have the capacity to cost out a system that is so incredibly complex, and that I have an understanding of a little bit, but nowhere near as the understanding that Dr. Pomeroy has.
Okay, then maybe I'll ask the same question to Dr. Pomeroy. If we don't have it down to the penny, do you have a high-level estimate, ballpark figure?
It's not something we've costed out. My feeling is that this would reduce redundancies that we have right now. We right now have 13 systems duplicating themselves across the country without help on some of the fundamentals. It would make each of those more efficient. It might reduce their costs at the provincial level. Federally, we're having a federal system in place, and it's a matter of coordination to make it a national system. We also could benefit from a national system because the Americans have something called the Cooperative Institute for Research to Operations in Hydrology. They put in, I put it in Canadian dollars, 489 million Canadian dollars over 5 years in this. They're drawing heavily upon the Canadian models we developed in Global Water Futures that aren't in operation in Canada yet, but are going to be in the United States, including all our shared river basins. So if we have a system that could take advantage of what's being developed in the continent, then we can apply things very efficiently, I think.
Could I add something, Mr. Graham? Yeah. I have a very strong hunch, given the figures we've heard about the cost of natural disasters in the last short while. I have a very strong hunch that the benefit would outweigh the cost by multiple orders. I mean, so I think that's important to keep in mind as well.
Okay. According to the website for Natural Resources Canada, they have something called the Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program, which I believe was launched late last year. I'd just like to read a quick quote from the website. It says, "The Government of Canada is investing over $227 million in the ongoing Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program to meet this need by updating and expanding its existing flood mapping capabilities." And it goes on to say that Natural Resources Canada is leading this program in partnership with Environment and Climate Change Canada and Public Safety Canada. Can you give us an idea of how the initiative contained in Bill C-317 will align with these initiatives that are going on at Natural Resources Canada?
Well, before I pass it on to Dr. Pomeroy, I would suspect that a sophisticated national flood forecasting system would simply add to the accuracy of the flood mapping that is being done by NRCan, but I don't know if that's a correct way of looking at it.
The NRCan program, and I should say that I have funding from that to the University of Saskatchewan with our colleagues from the University of Calgary, and Laval and McMaster. But we're using the Environment Canada models that we developed with Environment Canada for that. So we're trying to coordinate it at the university end, and we're getting some support there, but a more formal process to do that would be very, very helpful. And because NRCan should be absolutely benefiting from the National Prediction Program in this floodplain mapping. So it's something that the individuals are trying to do, but it's ad hoc and kind of fragile, I'd say.
Mr. Chair, how am I doing for time? I'm done. Okay. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Mr. Longfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair, and Mr. Chair, and witness.
Because he hesitates. It's
And
like,
Madame Posey, you did a
no,
great
I'm not here
job.
for long.
This is a collaboration today. You've touched on a couple of things, Dr. Pomeroy. You mentioned about international a little bit in terms of the United States using some of the modeling from Canada. A constituent of mine has an advanced hydrology company that's been doing work in Bangladesh. It's called, the company is Hyde Tech Geomorphic, and they're doing hydraulic monitoring, they're doing fluvial geomorphology, all these words that have to do with droughts and floods, but working in Bangladesh, having access to the data there and then making the models. Also working with municipalities on helping municipal governments determine where their risks are. Could you maybe speak to Canada's role internationally, or Mr. Scarpellegia, where we have expertise in Canada that could actually have a huge economic benefit locally and an environmental benefit outside of our country?
Can I just preface that? I'm a firm believer, as you may know, Mr. Longfield, that Canada, as a water nation or a collection of water nations, should be playing a leadership role in helping the world achieve global water security. I believe that this is the new peacekeeping, really, the new peacekeeping role for Canada. So I believe that this is one area where we have the capacity to show leadership and to benefit from that leadership, economically as well, by sharing our expertise with the world. But I'll pass it on to
Thank you. Unless you have something substantial to add, but that was a great answer.
I would just give a few examples.
Okay.
In the Global Water Futures Program, we did deploy the models we developed in Canada to Central Asia, to the Ganges, to the Andes in South America, and to the Pyrenees in Spain with great success. And there are clearly aid and commercial opportunities to do this sort of thing from Canada that have not been exploited. These were one-off pilot projects, but there's much more that could be done.
That's great. And I love the vision of peacekeeping, and environment is a global feature. It's not a local feature. If we come back to locally, I met today with the Canadian grain growers of Canada, and we were talking about the Guelph Statement of Sustainable Agriculture, the road to 2050, of how farmers are working on sustainability. And I was able to talk to some farmers that they brought into the meeting, one from the Lethbridge area in Alberta. We had one from Saskatchewan. We had another person from Alberta that were talking about water monitoring in the soil. And so on the other side, the drought side of things, and as you mentioned, the allocation of water. One farmer from Alberta said that his allocation is going to be 1 inch of water this year. And what he does based on that information is he changes crops to low water crops. He's going to barley instead of sugar beets. But even last year, the farmer from Saskatchewan said she was able to keep her yields up by changing crop decisions. And so how the modeling can impact farmers' decisions to put the right crops in the ground, knowing what the drought situation forecast could be. Could you maybe speak to how important that is for our farming community to have access to this information?
Yes, it's something we don't do now, but I believe the technical capabilities are there. They need to be assembled. They need to be operationalized. Environment Canada produces monthly and seasonal forecasts. Those forecasts could be used to force models, the same models we use for flood prediction or drought prediction on this seasonal basis. And that, I think, would have tremendous benefit, as you mentioned, because it would be information in time to be actionable by the farmers to make the shifts so they can stay in business.
And so the monitoring, not necessarily on the reservoirs, but actually on soil moisture content. And the farmer from Quebec said, I need drain tiles. He's got floods. So he has to make different decisions on getting drain tiles on his fields.
Yes, the monitoring, you can measure soil moisture from space with some accuracy, at least shallow soil moisture. But to get deep soil moisture, you need sensors in the ground. And that's where we have this Global Water Futures Observatories network, which has these sorts of things. They tend not to be done provincially, and the federal government just has them at Ag Canada stations. So.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. On to Madame Bozé for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. The floods, the droughts, of course, both are related to how much water there is and can take place at different times, last different time periods, and they take place in a number of different places, of course, all very diverse. And you feel there's an advantage to drawing this all together. Is there really an advantage to managing threats of flood and drought within a same strategy? And do you know if this is being done elsewhere in another G7 country, for example? Is there an optimal model?
Yes, it's part of what's called Earth system modeling, Earth system prediction, and this is where Europe has been headed with their approaches, as well as the United States. So the most sophisticated countries are going to these complete Earth system models, which have the general predictions that are possible for both floods and droughts, and potentially water quality episodes as we develop them in the future.
Et une autre question.
And another question. An article was published in Nature about AI. It seems that it's possible to be highly accurate even if in rivers there aren't any sensors, any gauges for water levels. So, using artificial intelligence, do you think there are any risks to security? Are we far enough ahead, really, in our understanding of all this to use artificial intelligence for these purposes?
Artificial intelligence certainly has a role. It's essentially data-driven techniques, and where these models have been tested in Canada, they haven't done very well because we don't have very much data. We have parts of Canada which have a stream gauging network that's as sparse as the developing world. This is when you get into northern Canada or the really remote rural areas. So we don't have the data to train it. And further, we have, with changing climate and new types of floods and things like that, the historical data that would train the AI systems is not what we're going to see in the future. But they have a role, and perhaps in combination with some of the physics-based models that are out there, that they can provide some benefit. And certainly on the human side of it, they can provide tremendous benefit.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of the 2.5 minutes. And Ms. Collins for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Pomeroy, you mentioned insurance costs, and in the next panel, we're going to be talking to some folks who have been looking at areas that can't get insured because of climate impacts. And I'm curious, this could be to Mr. Scarpielleggia or to Dr. Pomeroy, do you have any concerns that this kind of forecasting could impact Canadians who are in these areas and their insurability, and kind of what responsibility does government have to ensure that insurance companies are still, and insurance is still available to Canadians?
That's a really interesting question. I would think that, I know that when flood maps are redesigned, and there are flood maps, the flood maps are being redesigned in Quebec at the moment, and it's creating a lot of controversy because all of a sudden, if you find that your house is in what is now considered a flood zone, you lose a great deal of value on your property. I would think that accurate forecasts, as long as they're accurate, then you're not getting a false picture or a picture that could be called into question. That you are getting an accurate picture of risks, and I suppose it could influence insurance costs, but I think the flood itself would have an impact on one's insurance. And that's why the government is bringing in, and I'm not speaking for the government. As I said before, I'm not representing the government, but the government did commit to a low-cost national flood insurance program for those who can no longer get insurance. And some of my areas in my riding have been touched by floods twice now in 2017 and 2019, and people just can't get insurance anymore there.
Two things. One is that the insurance companies are already running their models in secret. There's a number of them across Canada. They're all different, and I don't think any of them are very good. So some people are being charged for floods that they shouldn't have. The second is that if we can predict floods, we can reduce damages, and that should reduce costs all around the board. So that's so imagine what our damages for crops would be if we or other events if we had no weather forecasts at all. So the same thing for flood forecasts. We can reduce damages this way, and we should be able to reduce insurance costs.
Very good. That's it for 2.5 minutes. So on to Mr. Deltel for 5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. And kind MP, it's nice to see you working on this. Dr. Pomeroy as well.
Vous avez utilisé, docteur, une image qui m'est restée.
So you brought up an image that really struck me, saying that every province and territory has built its own wheel, if you wish. So we've got 13 wheels we're trying to work with, and that the aim of this bill put forward by our colleague from Lac-Saint-Louis is to bring these all together in a single vehicle. Do you think we can do this quickly, or will it take years before all 13 wheels are rolling in the same direction?
The wheels are all different right now, and some are pretty sophisticated and some are very, very simple. So there'll be tremendous benefit early on for the jurisdictions which have no system or simple systems provided by this. The more advanced jurisdictions will also see it. In our discussions with them for the province of Quebec, they saw benefit to using both the federal and the provincial model that they had to give them some idea of the uncertainty in the predictions in there. So I think we can see immediate benefits all around. And because these systems all exist, I would think a rapid evolution towards improvement will happen. And then eventually, perhaps the concerted generation of the next phase, the next generation of prediction models can occur on a national basis. That will take longer, but it's certainly possible.
You also raised the example of the United States of America that has, and you said that earlier, that in some point they have that kind of system that the member of Lac-Saint-Louis would like to apply. Can you give us some indication how can we get inspiration from the experience in America that can be useful for us?
A number of things there. One is that they do not do it all from Washington. They have regional centers. Even though they're federally led, they're based on river basins. So Northeast U.S., North Central U.S., Alaska, Northwest, and on river basins. They also coordinate heavily with the states involved and with the other communities to do so. And then finally, but they have the central resources for the supercomputer systems and the army of scientists that they have in different agencies, such as U.S. Geological Survey and their Weather Service and the Army Corps of Engineers. They have to coordinate all of this as well. But they've done it reasonably well over time, but still feel they need to make much further and much more rapid progress. That's why they set up this new cooperative institute to accelerate the improvements in that.
When did they create that facility, or I would say that institute to work all together in the same front?
This goes back at least to the 1960s, and that's perhaps before. So, but it was you don't see the states doing this really at all down there, except helping with expertise into the federal system. So it's a bit of a different constitutional setup as well.
Supposons que le projet de loi est voté et
So let's say that we vote on this bill, it's adopted, and the Senate adopted as well within the next month. Based on your knowledge, what you know of the Canadian and the American systems, how long, more or less, would it take before Canada really winds up with one single wheel, everyone rolling in the same direction, all 13 instances, and that this, is working efficiently.
I see it still as 13 wheels, but one engine supplying extra power to those wheels as they need.